In this video, I wanted to go over a little bit more detail about filling out the research log because you will be getting your second and final graded project today, and part of that grade will be based on your filling out research logs for 2 research problems. So let's talk a little bit about the first section, the initial facts. I think people did mostly pretty well on this. If I had one thing I would suggest is to include some of the key small facts for the research problem. So for example, in our first research problem, it had to do with a rental apartment for Mr. Porter. We know that he lived in the apartment for 4 years. We know that he moved out recently, but we didn't have the exact date, and that he got half of the security deposit back, and that it's been 3 weeks. So some of these key dates might be important to remember as you're going through the research problem. Another thing that I would remind you is you can always refer back to the research problem as you're doing your research and as you're writing up your answer. It seems like people, even people who noted some of the small key facts in the beginning, when you were writing your answer, maybe didn't refer back to the problem or didn't refer back to your own notes and missed a couple of small issues. So this is an academic class, right? So we're giving you some hints as to what we're looking for, and those hints are going to be in the facts of the research problem. All right, the next section I wanted to talk about was really the research plan and search query. So the client goals, people are doing pretty well with that. In terms of the research plan, this is definitely an area where most people, the majority of the class, were not being detailed enough. So we need enough detail that we can follow your search process and make sure that you're using the sources and the search techniques that we've been suggesting in class. So this section might end up being more detailed for you for class than you might end up using in practice, but it is because we're looking for those skills and sources, right? So we're trying to give you a grade not just based on your answer, but also on the research process that you used. That's why the research logs are worth a percentage of the final project grade. So the first thing you're going to want to include are your search terms. So the beginning part, it's all about the brainstorming process, and part of that is coming up with search terms, thinking of if you're going to run a Boolean search, what that might look like. And then you're going to want to talk about your search plan. So what's your strategy going to be? Are you going to start with a mass.gov site? Are you going to try and run a Google search? What are the treatises that you think might be helpful for the research problem? So for our first landlord-tenant research problem, I'm brainstorming. I'm thinking maybe something at the Mass Trial Courts, about page might be helpful. I'm probably going to try and run a few Google searches. I'm going to want to browse to some kind of MCLE materials. I might want to use it on Lexis or the MCLE Online Pass because it's easier to use in that format. So all these kinds of little details, just a little bit more about what your search plan is. So a lot of people didn't break this down into plan and then action. We really want to see you taking the time to come up with a search plan before you jump into your actual searches. So just, you can see here it's not that long, but give us a little bit more detail about what your plan is. Okay, so the next part is after you do your search plan, and I'm going to post this for you so you'll have an example, but the next part after the search plan are your actual searches. And they don't have to, you can see it, my notes are not that detailed, but I'm telling you, where did I start? Did I run a Google search? What were my search terms? Did I use the search terms I listed above? What did I find? And just a few notes about how I ran some searches. Again, it doesn't have to be too detailed, but enough that we can tell that you're using the techniques we covered in class and the sources we covered in class. Now for me, I separate out the sources below and talk about the sources, and I just include some details about the searches here. Some people kind of put those two things together, which is fine. You don't have to do it, your research log, exactly like I have mine set up, but you have to have these key pieces to it so that we can evaluate your search process, okay? So the next part would be the secondary sources that you consulted. And here what I saw is people didn't give enough detail. So you can see there's not a ton of detail here, but there's a little bit of a summary of why the source was useful or in some cases not particularly useful, including the date. So one thing that you're going to want to pay attention to is how current is the source that you're looking at. That gives you a sense of how much updating you're going to have to do. For example, this legal tactics was dated 2008, but then when I actually went into it, the chapter I was looking at had been updated in 2013. And I noted that it had links to a lot of statutes and cases that I found helpful. The other thing I wanted to talk about here is this MCLE treatise. So I saw this a lot, like if you're in the MCLE treatise or the mass practice, a lot of times people are giving just one specific little subsection, even though there could be a lot of different subsections that would be helpful. What I think you should be doing is opening up the table of contents and kind of poking around, making sure that you're listing all, or at least the most helpful sections, or making a note that there's many helpful sections with a few of the ones you found most helpful. Okay, so that's just giving a little bit more detail on the secondary sources that you looked at. The next section is the primary law, so that's what you're going to rely upon in a lot of what you're putting into your answers. And a couple of things here. So for example, the first thing I did was I listed the statutes I had found using the secondary sources, and I put some extra notes that I didn't see in a lot of people's, and that is how current the statute is. And this one I just got right on Lexis, so when I did the copy link, it just fills that right in. So I have a currency date already. Then I put down my notes on what were the key provisions. I could have summarized this a little bit more. I was just in a hurry, so I just kind of cut and pasted in some instances. I probably would summarize this a little bit more in my actual answer. These are just my notes in my research trail. Okay, so for statutes, definitely want to include the little bit of notes as well as the currency date. Same for regulations. You want to understand what the currency date is, and I just updated some of these so they're fairly current. And also notes as to what the key sections were. On the cases, I want a little bit of a note as to why you thought that case was important. And you know, it doesn't have to be, as you can see, it doesn't have to be very long, just a little teeny note in what cases that you looked at. The next section that we have is persuasive authority. So this would be where you would list lower court cases, cases that aren't in our jurisdiction. For example, I have one here from the First Circuit, unreported cases, etc. So they're primary law, but they're not binding authority. So this case wasn't precedential, but it was so similar to our case, it was helpful for interpretation. So the final section, which is where I saw a lot of people not give enough detail, is the wrap-up section. So this is where you have to list all the primary law that you relied upon in your answer, and then note any kind of updating you did. So for example, when I look at this Mass General Laws, Chapter 186, Section 150B, when I looked at that, there was pending legislation. Now, our problem, because the legislation is in the future, most of this probably wouldn't affect us, but I took a quick look. One of the provisions had to do with a late fee, but the other ones, if this were a problem that was in the future with a similar problem as our fact pattern, and if this bill gets passed, which they're currently just introduced, so they're not passed yet, but it would affect treble damages. So I just kind of made a note. It lets me know that you looked at the pending legislation to see if there was any chance it would be applicable to our problem. Again, the same for the other statutes. When you're looking at the CMR, you note how current it is, and then I also did a quick little search on the Mass Register on Lexis, just using my citation information to make sure there was no applicable regulations that were more current than the currency date. Okay. In what I'm looking at cases, I'm just wanting to know any kind of yellow flag and why they were distinguished. The note doesn't have to be too long, but I want to understand if there was negative treatment. So most of the ones that I was relying on, there were no flags on Lexis. But for example, this one, Taylor versus Beedry, there was a yellow flag for the 2009 case, not for the 2012, but the discussion was good in the 2009 case. So if I wanted to rely on this 2009 case, I want to understand what the yellow flags were for. Okay, so again, I'm going to post this to give you an example, but just I want to make sure that every time you cite something that has a yellow flag, you're noticing that and understanding why it's okay for you to still be citing it. And of course, that would be even more so if there was a red flag. Then if you have any additional questions, for example, what was the actual last date of tenancy, something like that, that would also go in this wrap-up section. Okay, so hopefully those notes will help you when you're putting together your research log on the final project.